Wang impromptu poem. You came from my old hometown, so you may know what's happening there. The day you left, beneath my latticed window, were the cold plums yet in flower. So we continue with the fifth and last of Wang Wei's 5 quatrains included in the 300 Tang Poems anthology. Now, pretty similar to some of the poems in this format, I imagine, and even in Wang Wei's group, this is at least on the face of it, it's a pretty simple poem. The title is translated by this translator, which is in this case Geoffrey Waters, as impromptu poem, like an improvisation. I searched for it in another translation that I have with all of Wang Wei's poems, and I found it in a group of 3 that were called miscellaneous poems. So I imagine the main idea here is that these poems are, these 3 poems, including this one, would be either improvised on the situation, or not meant to fit rigidly into any of the typical categories in which Chinese poetry is generally classified. So what's the subject matter of this impromptu poem? It's pretty straightforward. I would say there are 3 minor topics in this poem. The first one is nostalgia of one's home. So the poem is presented as a short dialogue between the poetic persona of Wang Wei and another unnamed person who has just come from Wang Wei's home, maybe from his home province or his hometown. Well, because of the details about his house and his garden, probably from his hometown. And in this conversation, Wang Wei just asks about one item, and we'll comment about that later when we comment the second couplet. That's the quaintness of the poem. Who is the thing or the person he's asking for when a person comes to visit him or is passing by from his hometown? So the main topic, as I said, is nostalgia, maybe missing one's roots, one's home, which is a pretty conventional topic in Chinese poetry. Remember, score officials had this antithetical or this paradoxical relationship with wanting to be next to their family and to their home seat, but at the same time wanting to serve in the capital and even accepting the obligation to serve in the provinces as civil servants. Another topic connected with this one would be, was very minor, would be traveling. So being away more than traveling, really. The speaker to which Wang Wei refers to is a traveler. He has come to the capital, and Wang Wei can be seen as, not exactly as a traveler, but at least as an uprooted person who is far from his home. And finally, I would say there's a slight seasonal element in the image that appears in the second couplet. Cold plums yet in flower seems to be pointing us towards late winter, early spring. The plum, May, in Chinese, is a very early flowering fruit tree. It's white, generally white flowers, start to flower when it's still winter. So in our calendar, that would probably be in maybe late February, March, and in China, in the traditional Chinese calendar, would have been around the beginning of the first month, I imagine. Okay, so this is a quatrain, so not many lines, and it's a pentasyllabic quatrain, which means even less words per line. Let's take a look at it as we usually do, couplet by couplet. I would say the first couplet here, this is a very typical division in any quatrain, the first couplet versus the second couplet. So I'd say the first couplet really creates the situation, which is basically, it sets the background for the rest of the poem. Like Wang Wei is speaking to someone who comes from his town and he makes inquiries. And the second couplet is the specificity. What is Wang Wei inquiring exactly about? So first couplet, you came from my old hometown, so you may know what's happening there. So this is a pretty straightforward line. As I said, it could be almost seen as a dialogue or a real phrase or sentence emitted by Wang when he encounters in the capital or wherever he is with a person who is coming from his hometown. He says, okay, you come from there, my old hometown, because Wang is no longer living there. And a logical assumption to make when somebody is coming from your hometown is, well, you will probably be able to give me some news about the people there. What type of news? Well, I imagine the most obvious one to think about would be asking about parents and relatives or friends living in the hometown, or if you have left your wife or concubines there, about them. So these are the expectations that the first couplet is creating, which will nevertheless be negated in the second couplet. So second couplet, the day you left, beneath my latticed window, were the cold plums yet in flower. So instead of asking, this is paradoxical to say the least, instead of asking about family members, friends, relatives, Wang asks this man about a plum tree. So this plum tree was beneath the latticed window, so in the garden of Wang Wei's house, family estate. And, we might assume that he might have developed a certain fancy for it. Maybe he planted it himself. And he probably spent a lot of late winters, early springs gazing out of those latticed windows and looking at it and finding some solace in its seasonal beauty. But anyway, so he's asked if the cold plums are yet in flower. Cold plums, because they, as we mentioned, they flower when it's still winter. And also they're generally white, which in a lot of Six Dynasties poetry, imitated also in Heian, Japan, leads to this topic of elegant confusion, which became one of the tropes of Six Dynasties poetry, like the poet gazing outside in late winter, early spring, sees the plum trees all covered in white, and does not know or gets confused if those white specks are the petals of the plum trees or the snow fallen from the skies. So it's an elegant topic. And that's it really. So it's a surprising image. It feels a bit contrived and a bit, Six Dynasty in this way, in that the poet is asking for the plum trees of that tree. The petals, the flowers of the plum from that tree. So, okay, perhaps those cold plums yet in flower are a metaphor, or are meant to be read as a metaphor for friends and family. Or perhaps it's, just the idea that those beautiful elements, that plum tree and its beauties are almost like a family member for Wang Wei, or, just an aesthetically pleasing element from his homeland that, creates nostalgia and a reminiscence of local beauty in his home. So that's it. I think there's not much to say about this poem. So a little piece of nostalgia about a beautiful flowering tree in just the right time of the year.